here I am, lined up to land at Upington, and on my right is a Russian Ilyushin, which is lining up on the long runway, which was probably paid for by the Americans, as I think it was an alternate airstrip for the space shuttle if it ever required it, which it never did. This video is really about my trip across the international border with my plane. I've never gone quite so far for an extended period of 10 days. So this little video describes what's involved. I've got my plans, got my map, and my little Excel spreadsheet which describes all the planning involved. Maybe a spoiler alert here, nothing bad happens on this trip. It was a great trip and everything worked out really well. I suppose part of a perfect trip is managing your expectations. Nothing really ever goes according to the exact plan, particularly when flying your plane in visual flight conditions. You're always going to need to adapt and change, particularly for weather. In our case, the only changes were we made the call to leave Cape Town a day early, because just before that a cold front was arriving in Cape Town, which would have had us stuck in Cape Town for about 3 or 4 days, which really would have messed up the planning and the bookings that we had. Second thing that happened was that the fuel at Lüderitz was contaminated, and so we needed to change our plans a little bit to be able to deal with that. Basically, you roll and adapt with changes that are required. This trip to Namibia was a bucket list item for me. I live in South Africa. I've never been to Namibia before, which is crazy because it's just on our northern boundary. I'd seen photos of open space, the natural beauty. To view it from a plane was definitely going to be a dream. While I was excited for the trip, there were kind of 2 stages of worry I had. First one was making the decision to go. These worries are basically more personal. Was I being selfish, not spending time with my kids or with Taryn? Could I afford the time away from work? Basically, once I'd made that decision to commit, this concern passed. Maybe I've got to the age where I realize that if the opportunity arises, best you don't skip it. Second area of worry was really a few days before leaving. Even though I knew that I was flying over big, large, very open and very dry spaces, I suppose it only really dawned on me just before, and I realized that it was really important to remain vigilant and careful. I deliberately chosen to travel solo, no passenger with me for this trip, as I knew having a passenger adds to the level of responsibility and can add some form of pressure. This isn't really carefree flying, even though it is big open flying. I managed this concern, really knowing that I had prepared. I was flying with friends, and this adds materially to the safety factor and the sense of comfort that you have. Let me give you a brief summary of the trip. It was definitely very special. I felt hugely privileged to see Namibia from this vantage point. Ultimately, I travelled 4,911 kilometers. It was over a period of 10 days. There were 8 days of flying, so 2 days of rest. There were 13 takeoffs and landings. I averaged about 2 hours flying a day, with a total of 20.2 hours in my logbook, and I travelled at an average speed of 258 kilometers an hour. The first and the last day were probably the days of the longest flying, as we routed up and then routed back. But anyway, that's enough of the statistics. Let me tell you a bit more about what worked. There were a lot of things that worked out well, including the accommodation, the routing, the weather, the transport, and the fuel. My biggest fear was probably that I'd get a flat tire, and actually no one in the whole group got that. Realistically, there are bigger issues than flat tires, but be that as it may. Let me get into some of the planning detail for you so you've got a sense of what's involved. Let me give you a sense also of what worked for me. There's a saying that if you don't prepare, you're prepared to fail, and I think the right preparation is important on a trip like this, and linking with like-minded people makes for good preparation at the end of the day. Ultimately, the reason why I went when I did was because experienced people were going, and this was pretty essential for me. From a safety perspective, I would not want to fly on my own, certainly not for the first time. We had a group of 8 aircraft, and even that's a bit large from a logistics perspective, because remember, when you all arrive at the same place at the same time, you all need transport, you all need accommodation. A group of 5 is probably the best size, and in our case, there were actually 3 of us who had different timing. We were going to come back a little bit earlier, and so we went off and diverted from the route a little bit. The 3 of us broke off, and we did parts of the trip as a 3-ship, which actually worked out quite well. As a group, we all were in communication. We left Morning Star a day early, as I said, to avoid the cold front that was approaching the Cape. I'd been travelling before, and so I hadn't organised any accommodation at Uppington, which is sort of an unscheduled stop. So as I arrived back in Cape Town, and before I left, I messaged Johan, and I said, "Johan, can I share a room?" "Yes, sure, no problem." And then when I was flying overhead Uppington in the afternoon, about to land, not too long before sunset, Martin heard me landing. He had hired a car, and he came out to fetch me. So I had accommodation and transport sorted for that first night, basically because of the help and support of the group, which is really useful. I think when it comes to the group, it's really important to contribute something in the form of either expertise or finding out stuff. By way of example, Mike had some family who were in some way connected with Hoab Lodge, and he suggested we go for lunch, so that was a great stop. On another occasion, Kai actually grew up in Walvis Bay, and so he had friends, and that's why we got the accommodation we got. He also had the use of a car, and he took us into Walvis and showed us where he grew up and how the place had changed. It's a real chance encounter which really enriches the trip. So I think it can pretty much be said that the group really makes the trip an experience at the end of the day. So who you travel with is really important. This group knowledge is important because it helps with where to stay. People have had good or bad experiences and they share them. They point out what's good to see and practical. They've also probably had a few experiences with landing fees and availability and cost of fuel, which they're happy to share that knowledge. There's the arranging of transport at the airfield, there's local knowledge, and there's flight and route planning, which is definitely useful to get that shared knowledge. You can't always read up or Google it at the end of the day. When it comes to route planning, a couple of the guys charted a potential route. We used an Excel sheet, which is basically the way we pooled our knowledge. That was the Excel sheet that I showed you at the beginning of the video. We generally planned distances based on landing of about half tanks was the plan, and in the case of the RV, that's legs not much longer than 2.5 hours. When it comes to planning legs, another limitation is your own comfort, whether it's your bladder or sitting on your bum. Generally 3 hours is the longest stretch that I can manage, so we planned around that accordingly. One of the other planning considerations is where you're going to go through passport control. We ended up leaving South Africa at Uppington, we entered Namibia at Keetmanshoop, and we left Namibia at Luderitz, returning via Uppington. That actually required us to do quite a dog leg on the way back, but that's what it is. You've got to go through passport control. I must say I did find passport control pretty friendly on both sides. In particular, Uppington, when we left, they were quite happy to share their mobile numbers, asked us when we would return so that we could call when we anticipated returning, just to make it easier. Just a big note on customs, they generally don't like to work over the weekend. I think they do work on a weekend, but they're probably not going to be that available, and that might mess with your timing at the end of the day. So generally plan to go through customs on a Monday through to Friday, a work week, not on the weekend. Planning wise on your routing, definitely consider airfields and fuel availability. That must be considered. been some occasions where we couldn't get fuel at a particular location, but we knew we had enough to get to the next one. When you choose your airfield, don't forget to consider the transport from the airfield. For example, Lüderitz airfield is actually quite far away from the town, probably 20 k's away or so. So you definitely need a vehicle. But in our case, we hired a car. I think it was from Avis. Pretty easy to organize as long as you've organized it before. They'll actually come to the airport for you. Sometimes when you're organizing transport, the accommodation will arrange it for you as well. When looking at your route, look for places of interest. We actually had two. One in particular was after leaving Keetmanshoop. Went a little bit left, and that took us past the Broekhorst volcanic crater, which is definitely worth visiting and flying around. Just a small deviation on our route, but because we had planned it before, we knew it was there. And then when we left Charshap, somebody had mentioned that the apple strudel at Solitaire was legendary. I must say, I did hear by the grapevine, the person who used to make it no longer does anymore, so I wouldn't call it legendary. Still worth a stop just to go and see that little place with the church and little dwellings and other things around there in the middle of the desert floor. So on that Excel sheet that I showed you previously, you can see an example of our planning where we set out the distances, the time, the fuel, even calculated the potential fuel uplift. When you look at that planning, have a damn good look at Google Earth on all the airfields before you go. It just helps orientate you at the end of the day. And then in the plane I kept a sheet for each airfield that I was going to, and gave myself the elevation, the runway headings and the frequencies. So it just makes it easier as you arrive, because those sort of things go through your head. Funny enough, at Swakopmund, my notes said to me, asphalt runway. Now, you would think that it was going to be a black runway in the middle of all the brown sand around there. Well, I was rather surprised to see that the runway was the same color as the rest of the sand around it. But it didn't matter, still found the runway and landed there, so that worked out fine. Once the route had been finalized, I popped the route on Sky Demon on my phone. It's pretty cool. They offer a 1-month membership or subscription for just £12. I'm not that familiar with all this sort of software, but I must say I did find it quite user-friendly. You just click and drag for small little deviations, and it kept a nice log afterwards, so I could track all of the flights and see how far I'd flown. So I thought Sky Demon was pretty user-friendly, and I was happy to use it. I have an old Garmin GPS in my plane, which could have done the job, but the Sky Demon was on my phone. I basically use that every leg, and obviously it doesn't require data while you're flying, so that works out well. So one of the considerations in planning there is, oh my goodness, what paperwork do we require? And there is a bit, you just have to get it done. There are a few things that you'll need. One of the major things is an overflight clearance, in this case overflight to Namibia. And the application you have to put through an agent, and you need to provide quite a bit of information and copies of information. So you need your pilot's license, your medical, your radio license, your plane's authority to fly, your plane certificate of registration, your plane's weight and balance, and a few other things that they list for you. So you have to get that together. You need to apply at least a month in advance. And don't forget, when you fill in the form, just add the extra dates on either side, so that if you need to leave a little bit early for weather, or you need to depart a little bit late for weather, you've got a little bit of wiggle room to deal with that. So add that in your dates. And one of the things about this little bit of documentation, it really does add to your anxiety, as it appears that it's issued just before you leave. In my case, the actual document actually has never ever arrived, but what I did get was a reference number literally on the day that I was due to leave. And that reference number is required because you need to add it into your flight plan, which you need to log as you cross the border. In other words, flight plan from Upington to Keetmanshoop, in our case, you need to add that reference number in. Some of the other documentation to consider: I did get hold of my insurance company just to make sure that my insurance on my plane was valid across borders into Namibia, and it did, so there was no additional paperwork for that, but it's just good to have that email on file before you go. The other paperwork is the normal border control forms, and as it happened, it's good to have a copy of your pilot's license and your medical on you, because when I came back into South Africa through Upington, they asked for information from those, so it's quite nice just to have those available so you can show them that. But there was no problem with that at all. They were pretty easy going. Another useful thing to have on you is just get the departure and arrival forms before, fill them in if you can. It just really makes it easier and quicker to complete, because they ask you things like addresses, where you're staying and things like that, which easier to fill in at home than sitting at a border trying to find that information. I kept a bit of a list for myself about what to pack, just to make sure I didn't forget anything. For Namibia, you can pack, and you must actually pack pretty light because you're going in your plane, so you don't want to take more than you need at the end of the day. It's not good for the plane to fill it up too heavy, and the other thing is you need to carry it wherever you go. So one bag that you can sling over your shoulder is probably the way to go. In Namibia, in winter, it's pretty damn dry, so you don't really sweat, but it can get warm, and it actually can also get down to freezing. So just make sure you've got what you need: a couple of pairs of jeans and a couple of tops and things like that. You are actually able to get a few things washed at some of the places where you stay, so it's never a problem if you haven't got enough. Rather get a few things washed. Obviously, take your chargers for whatever, your phone and other devices. Good to have those. Definitely take a fuel container. Generally, the collapsible one would be best, just because it sits easier in your plane. It proved really useful for us. Because the fuel at Lüderitz was contaminated, we took extra fuel from Swakopmund, loaded that back into the plane when we had landed at Lüderitz, and then we got a bit of MoGas in Lüderitz when we were driving around, and we used that just to top off the tanks at the end of the day. Probably didn't need it, but never a problem when you got too much fuel in your plane. Be aware that places like Swakopmund, the fuel operator is actually not allowed to dispense fuel directly into a container. So you have this little charade where you have to siphon from your tank into the container, and then the operator is happy to fill up your plane again. It is what it is. Don't argue it. He's got rules, and he's not going to deviate from that at the end of the day. Wind's a thing in Namibia. Sometimes it can blow quite hard, so take enough tie downs and other things to keep your plane stuck to the ground. Might not be that bad, but when you're away from your plane, it's really, and you hear the wind blowing, it's really good to know that your plane is well secure. One thing I didn't do was take a high-vis vest, which I actually got away with. I was only called out once, but essentially it's required on all ramps, so just take it and pop it on whenever you're walking around getting fuel and stuff like that. Obviously take appropriate spares and tools. I collaborated with one of the other guys that I was flying with, which basically means I totally relied on Johan. Johan built his RV8, so he's got all the bits and bobs. I just happened to take a spare tube and a couple of split pins and things like that, because, as I said, my biggest fear was a flat tire, and Johan had all the tools. So yeah, again, the benefits of going with a group where you've got guys with particular expertise. Some of the guys on the group took PLBs, personal locator beacons, and things like that. I happen to not have one. I would say if you were flying alone, it would be essential equipment in Namibia with those very large open spaces. In our case, I was flying generally in a group of 3, and I wouldn't be too worried because my mates would certainly know where I was if I happened to do an outlanding somewhere. As you saw in the other photo, I did take paper maps, mainly to look over and check out the journey and where we were going, but I do understand it is a legal requirement to have the paper maps in your plane. So I sat in my plane, but I actually didn't really use them at the end of the day. I did use them for my planning as I looked around at what sort of stuff would be coming up. The next thing to consider on a trip like this is the costs. I personally didn't have any surprise costs or anything that wasn't expected. Accommodation is whatever's good for your budget at the end of the day. You don't need to stay at the expensive lodges. There are some very expensive lodges that charge in dollars. They do seem to give SADC rates if you're from South Africa, so certainly inquire about those. And from what I remember, it was about 1,500 Rand a night on average, but remember that included breakfast and supper, and often they'd pick you up from the airfield, and you're well looked after in good accommodation for that. The other expense was landing fees, generally not at the lodges obviously, but at the municipal airfields, but that was just a couple of $100 and really wasn't that material at the end of the day. As I mentioned before, the overflight clearance was a cost. I think that was about 1,000 Rand that I had to pay for that. Just got a reference number at the end of the day. So the biggest cost that you're going to have is fuel, and that you can easily work out beforehand because you've got your flight plan. You know what hours you're going to be flying. You can pretty accurately work out what your fuel is going to cost you for your trip. The big thing you must look out for is that you have checked that the fuel is available, and that you have checked who the operator is and what the current prices are. At places like Swakopmund, it was pretty reasonable. It was the same cost as Morningstar, so there are no issues with that. There are certain lodges where the airfields are operated by charter companies. There, if you don't pre-check, you could find yourself getting a nasty shock with some very, very expensive avgas. But if you prepare appropriately, you won't be in for any surprises. If you're in harder to reach places and somebody has arranged to get fuel there for you, obviously you must expect to pay a little bit of a handling fee, which is reasonable, but that's pretty much pre-arranged. I happened to fly on avgas almost all of the trip, but in need I could put a little bit of mogas if required. As a matter of interest, all the fuel that we receive in South Africa and the Cape up to Mossel Bay comes from Namibia anyway, so there's no shortage of availability of avgas in Namibia. There are a couple of other things about the trip, and in no particular order. I didn't take much cash with me. My credit card worked fine just about everywhere I went, even in pretty remote areas where you'd think there'd be no connectivity, but no, credit card worked fine. They're happy to accept South African rands, and they'll give you change in Namibian dollars. Best you spend those before you come back to South Africa. I didn't take any roaming for my mobile phone, and I used Wi-Fi and accommodation in the lodges where I stayed, and that worked pretty well. There was only one evening where the Wi-Fi was a little bit patchy, but that really was no issue at the end of the day. There's going to be a requirement to file a flight plan. You have to do it when you cross the border, and just really get comfortable with that. There are a number of ways that you can do it. You can phone it in, you can use File to Fly, or you can use Sky Demon. Just make sure you've got credits on there to submit it. And there are a number of other ways, but just make sure you're all set up before you go and that it's good to go, because it's not an issue to file a flight plan, and if you know how to do it, just bang it in, and then it's done, no issue. With each leg that you do, just plan the leg and examine the airspaces. We only really messed up once, and that was when we were flying north from Sources area up to Swakopmund. Just before you get there, you go under the Walvis Bay TMA, but because you cross their centre line, I now understand that they do want you to file a flight plan anyway, despite the fact that you're actually out of their airspace. Sometimes, no matter what you read up, it might not be that accurate, and that's why a little bit of local knowledge helps. And there are schools and other people in the area, and it's worth just getting hold of them and just asking a quick question: do I need to file a flight plan, or what do I need to do? You just don't want to aggravate anybody, which wasn't the case. Nobody caught us out or told us off about anything. One of the things that you should do is obviously track the weather. We were very fortunate. We only had one bit of rain as we were coming down south from Walvis Bay towards Lüderitz. I saw some clouds ahead, and there was actually a bit of a rain cloud as we came into Lüderitz, which had just gone past, which was fine, so we missed the weather there. And then on our flight from Lüderitz through to Uppington, we expected some rain around about the middle over the Fish River Canyon, and we knew that if we departed at 10 o'clock, the weather would have moved further north, and sure enough it did. The other thing to monitor from a weather perspective is just the wind, because sometimes that can be pretty hectic, and depending where you're landing, particularly if it's around mountains, you must just make sure it's not a hectic crosswind at the end of the day. The wind wasn't always that kind to us. On the way up to Uppington, I was in a headwind as I was routing northwards, and then sure enough, basically all the routing south, we were into a headwind as well. So it's just the luck of the draw, it's what happens. But you must remember, we planned our legs to be relatively comfortable. If you know you're ending on half tanks, then it's not a problem if you're going to fly a little bit longer just because of a headwind. Conditions wise, we never really bounced or had any turbulence to speak of anywhere, so the winds weren't a problem at all, and the weather was very good. As a matter of interest, after takeoff, you generally don't see anybody in your group unless you deliberately fly together, which Jan and I basically mostly did, kept in contact with each other. But it's always cool to chat to the people around you. You comment on the things that you see, so choose a chat frequency and make sure that you've briefed before, so you're all on that. It really does help. And sometimes there's more than one frequency to monitor, so if three of you are flying together, you can all choose a frequency, monitor it, and then just call up each other if there's something of interest that we need to take note of. When it comes to the radios, as a matter of interest, I hardly spoke to ATC on the route actually, and that's because they generally couldn't hear me, or I couldn't hear them. And I understand that's not particularly unusual. It wasn't really an issue, because what you do is you do report on the general frequencies, so you're always keeping a lookout for other traffic on those frequencies. I happened to speak to basically the towers if they were manned. That was really the only radio work with air traffic controllers that I had. Otherwise, there were no problems there. The runways that we encountered, they can be sandy and they can be quite stony, but they're all in pretty good condition, and certainly long enough for an RV. I flew with spats on the whole way, and they were fine. They got a few dings on them, but nothing more than usual that one would expect when you're flying with spats into untarred, unprepared airstrips. So when I consider the trip as a whole, I suppose the strange thing is, when last did you spend just 10 days focused on yourself? Generally my time is focused on my work and my family, and it was only really upon returning that it actually dawned on me that I devoted 10 days on just me. It actually took me a little while to adjust back to normal life. And there are a couple of highlights for me on this trip. I don't think I could have planned a better route for a first visit. There's a lot of Namibia to see. I didn't go as far north as Etosha, which is obviously something I'd like to do one day. But I certainly saw quite a lot for a first trip. I think one of the thrilling things was, as I arrived over to see the dunes at Sossusvlei, it was truly breathtaking, and being a bit higher made it really beautiful. I think the Brandberg mountain, which you see soon after takeoff from Swakopmund as I headed north up to Huab, it was actually directly on our track, but as you take off you see it there. It's quite an impressive mountain to see from so far away. I think one of the really impressive things is just the big open spaces that you have in front of you. It really is open land, and then it transforms itself and changes below you as you fly along and drops away places. They call Gemsbok an oryx, and it's quite a majestic animal living out there in the desert with the long horns, and they seem to be totally unimpressed with an aircraft as it flew by, but they are something to behold standing out there in those big wide open spaces. One of the things I will remember is following the river. Once I've taken off from Cloverfontein, followed that river down to the coast. It's interesting how in some places there are reeds and everything. You even visibly see the water in the river, and then it disappears into the earth to emerge a couple of almost 100 kilometers away as it heads towards the coast. So a remarkable vantage point to see the river like that. Probably one of the most special parts of the trip was that route down from Swakopmund, Walvis Bay, and down to Luderitz. Those dunes where they meet the sea is something I'll definitely remember as you go past various shipwrecks that sort of scatter that coastline. But I think probably one of the big things was just flying every day, going for walks, hanging with friends. It was just really a total distraction at the end of the day. Namibia truly is a beautiful country. It's the second most sparsely populated country in the world. I'm not saying I don't like people, but wow, a country that has so few people in it has a lot to be said for itself. Beautiful open spaces, and I really feel privileged to have viewed it from the vantage point that I did high above. And I was very happy to go with the people that I went with. It certainly made the trip. So if you're thinking about a trip like this, plan it and do it. Don't wait. It's a great trip.